fire is lit and the forest is quiet, growing roots from all wisdom will carry us home. When the fire is lit and the forest is quiet, growing roots from all wisdom will carry us home. When the fire is lit and the In the heart of the forest, a woman sat alone by the fire. It was the last day of the end of an era, so she was making a fire and putting all the things that she didn't need anymore into the fire. At long last, she brought out a crystal and held it above the flames, watching it glow and observing the color and shape it would become when exposed to the heat.
And slowly, ever so slowly, the crystal started to glow blue. First it was just a tinge and then grew more intense, and she knew that that was significant. She gazed at the children who were playing nearby, and she realized that soon, now in fact, she would have to leave them for some time in search of herself. She reached into her pocket and she pulled forth a thin thread, a charm thread. It pulsed gently in her hand, as if to tell her, now is the time.
And because she knew she had to leave, she summoned a shining lioness to take care not just of the children, but of the whole community on her behalf.
As she started pulling the thread, it pulled her back to her ancestors and towards a long-held prophecy.
But even as she felt the pull of her ancestors, she also felt concern for the children she was leaving behind, wondering whether they would be safe in the protection of this shining lioness.
She watched the lioness guiding the children away from the fire, and she followed them. They walked for hours and hours. They went through fields, wheat fields, sunflower fields, and they went deep into the woods. So thick were the trees that it was increasingly difficult to see the sunlight, and soon she lost track of time. She didn't know whether it was day or night, and yet the children were calm and peaceful, following the lioness. Eventually they arrived at a clearing where the sun was shining brightly, and all the children were dancing around the radiant lioness. And the woman saw that they were happy, and that she could now safely leave to resume her quest. And it just so happens that this particular spot was exactly the place that would allow her to travel back in time.
But before she left, she bent down and gathered a handful of stones from the edge of the woods. And to each child she gave a small stone, an enchanted stone, so that in case they needed her, they could simply hold the stone and think of her, and she would appear in front of them.
The children held the stones with care, realizing how precious they were, gazing at them and wondering about the day they might have to use them. One child became so curious and started rubbing the stone, and as they rubbed it, the scent of bay leaves emanated from the stone, and the smell was so overpowering that the child felt as if it was flying, hovering above the ground, watching all the children playing happily together. But just as the woman was taking her leave, she saw that they were surrounded by a huge serpent slithering around them, and it felt like danger, real danger.
The woman moved back a few steps to see the serpent more closely, and sensing the power of her ancestors and drawing strength from the woods, she looked straight into the eyes of the serpent, and the serpent stared back at her. The woman spoke to the serpent, and she said, "I'm going to give you something really powerful that will make you tingle and then fall asleep." And from her pocket, she pulled a little pouch filled with medicinal plants, and the serpent, mesmerized by the woman, took the leaves into his mouth and began feeling a tingling sensation. And the woman also took leaves into her mouth, and suddenly they both fell in the grass in a kind of ecstatic dance. The moon was shining, and the light was turning blue, and beautiful fields of flowers emerged around the pair, and the woman was totally overcome by this moment of bliss that she had found together with the serpent.
And in this trance, feeling relaxed and dancing and seeing colors and lights around her, at some point she couldn't really figure out where she ended and where the serpent started. It seemed like they were just twirling, but then it started turning into something dark, something she didn't really want, and she sensed she had completely lost control. She suddenly realized that she was covered in scales, and the serpent was growing limbs and looked more and more like her. And she heard voices. Voices that sounded like the voices of her ancestors speaking to her, telling her that in the past she had become so detached from everything around her that she no longer enjoyed the present, and that her heart had hardened and had become covered in scales. Her blood had turned cold. All warmth was leaving her body, and she could see herself turning into the serpent, and the serpent turning into her. And she realized that in her search, she didn't really need to go anywhere. The only change that was necessary was within herself.
Slowly, she emerged from her trance, and she found herself lying beneath an enormous tree. And under this enormous tree, in the heart of the showy woods, she could see that it was almost dawn, and that she had spent the whole night in the woods, feeling this transformation in her body.
She looked down at her hand, and she was still holding the charmed thread, and it was now shining blue. She began singing and dancing, and all the children gathered around her while she sang the most beautiful song. The children sat with their stones, looking at them and rubbing them, so all kinds of beautiful scents filled the air.
And now the lioness decided that it was time for her to go. So she called all the children around her, and she gave 2 of the children a protective amulet and said, "You must protect the woman that is undergoing this transformation. Keep this amulet with you at all times. The moment will come when the woman will need to be protected, because if she's not protected, she will die and you will be in great danger. You must use the amulet in the moment that you think the woman needs your help." And with that, the lioness disappeared into the woods forever.
And with the lioness gone, now it was just the woman and the children. But the woman couldn't move. Her feet were turning into roots, plunging deeper and deeper into the soil, into the earth. And she suddenly started swaying, and as she swayed, she was turning into a tree. Her skin turned to bark. It became brown and covered in moss. At that moment, her last thoughts surfaced that this was one way of connecting with her past, with who she was, with these deep roots that she was growing. And at the same time, she was growing taller and taller and taller, reaching for the sky, and she felt more fulfilled. She felt like she was where she belonged. And she was surrounded with the children, and she was at peace. At first, the children felt like they were on their own, with the lioness gone and the woman there but not really present. They felt vulnerable. The two children who were given the amulet didn't really know what to do with it. So at first there was a bit of a panic. And they did what children usually do. They went through phases where they played and then at times they were scared. And the older ones comforted the little ones. But at some point one of them said, "Wait, shh, listen." And they realized that the wind blowing through the branches and the leaves was actually producing music. And they formed a circle around the tree, and they added their voices to the music, and their voices were reaching into the upper branches of the tree. The tree was still swaying, and they were all dancing and singing together. But suddenly, something happened. Something terrible.
All of a sudden, they couldn't hear the music anymore. They couldn't hear the voices anymore. There was no chanting. Everything was completely quiet. And they knew that what was coming was a raging storm. And they were frightened because they weren't sure that the woman's roots had grown enough for her to be safe. And because as she had turned into a tree, they didn't know how much of her body had actually transformed under the earth into roots. They were very scared and they wanted to protect her.
So they all held each other's hands around the tree, and they started to remember all the stories and all the singing their grandmother used to sing. And they started singing those stories, and while they were singing and swaying, they started growing roots together, strengthening this tree's roots. And all those roots were twisted and intertwining with her roots to make a stronger, more powerful connection between all of them together.
And that was the prophecy the woman had been searching for, the prophecy from her ancestors, that in order to save the community, in order to save the town, they needed to create roots together.
When the fire is lit and the forest is quiet, growing roots from all wisdom will carry us home. When the fire is lit and the forest is quiet, growing roots from all wisdom will carry us home. When the fire is lit and the forest is quiet, growing roots from all wisdom will carry us home. Is quiet, growing roots from all wisdom will carry us home. When the fire is lit and the forest is quiet.
If you could choose a different covering for your body, which would you pick? Feathers, scales, fur, or prickly spines? Probably scales, just the idea of like the mermaid and swimming and seeing what's underwater.
What animal best represents you?
A lioness, for sure.
Yeah.
Would you rather travel back in time to meet your ancestors, or into the future to meet your descendants?
Okay.
Probably travel back. Ancestors.
When do you feel most peaceful? I feel most peaceful when I am in nature, even in the woods or in the water. It's a glowing crystal. One day, this woman was making a fire because it was the end of an era. But she was also holding a glowing crystal above the fire.
Charmed thread. She started looking at the children who were playing outdoors. She she took out of her pocket this charmed thread that she had, and she knew that it was the time to start following it.
Something terrible happened, a raging storm.
Wow.
All of a sudden, they couldn't hear the music anymore, they couldn't hear the voices anymore, there were no more chanting, and they knew that what was coming was like a raging storm.
Twisted. So they all held each other's hands around the tree, and they started to remember all the stories and all the singing their grandma used to sing. And while they were singing and swaying, they started getting more roots to strengthen this tree's roots, and all those roots were twisted into her roots to make more strong and powerful connection between all of them together.
Excellent.
Oh my goodness, I'm getting emotional. It's so, I feel so into it.
And I like the fact that sometimes when someone picks a card, you kind of think, if it was my turn, that's what I would say.
Yes.
And then the person says something completely different, and it gives new meaning to the word.
And talking about the second language, I mean, I'm not great with vocabulary. You know, I have so many words. I don't know what this means if it's not in a sentence. But that's helping my language as well. Because when I knew, for example, okay, oh serpent, oh yeah, my child plays with serpentines all the time, but they are horrifying.
Yeah.
So it's perfect. Yeah.
It's funny how the first words we put down, they related to the question, so they got meaning for us, and then in the story they completely changed.
Yeah, absolutely, yes. Like when you listen to the person right before you, it's a bit challenging because you want to listen, you want to imagine and get in, you know, and let go, but you also know that at some point they might stop. And then it's your turn. So there's this constant like, oh, I just want to let go and enjoy, and then they go, no, but I have to focus.
And you still have something from you in the story.
Yes.
So the bay leaves, the ancestor, all this, like, it connects me, the flying, I love all of them, and it has loads of stories in mind. So it does still follow you while you're talking about the story. It's just...
It's hard to form a story like on the spot, and I don't know, I really like listening to it and creating from it. It was great.
I like our story. I'm gonna read it to my kids. Literally, I'm gonna, yeah. Oh, I have no idea why my mom gave me this pot. All her beautiful cooking, all her amazing recipes. This is just, I can smell the food with this pot. And then I listen, I hear your music, and then I come and put the pot.
And the stone will be floating, we can all share some food.
That's good.
If the fire is lit and the water is boiling, the stone will be floating, we can all share some food. If the fire is lit and the water is boiling, and the stone will be floating, we can all share some food.
So I come, so you'll be singing that.
I got the whole song.
Oh, you have so why don't you start?
Just the chorus.
Okay.
As she started pulling the thread, it pulled her back to her ancestor and a long-held prophecy. It pulled her back to her ancestors and towards a long-held prophecy.
You must use the amulet in the moment that you think. Good? Good. Yay! Oh, nice one.
Very nice.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Looks good.
I can go. Giorgia, do you need help?
Mine is way shorter, don't worry.
Yeah?
When the fire is lit and the forest is quiet, growing roots from all wisdom will carry us home.
1248.
When the fire is lit and the forest is quiet, growing roots from all wisdom will carry us home.
Okay.
Ciao.